Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm here with Loki and we're going to be discussing Stravinsky today, and I think this is the first time on the channel with the long form videos that we talked about Stravinsky. I've been promising to talk about Stravinsky for several weeks in the shorts that we do on the channel now. So here we go, one of my favourite composers. It's very exciting to get going with Stravinsky, and I'm not going in with the Rite of Spring. That's very deliberate because the Rite of Spring, wonderful piece though it is, and I may well do it in a future video, I kind of want to, but it's vastly overbalanced in terms of the way Stravinsky is viewed in our culture. Most people who know about Stravinsky know the Rite of Spring, but very few people know much else, apart from, I guess a few people know the Firebird, Symphony of Psalms, but you know, his wonderful and incredibly consistent output is largely unknown. And it's high time that we all got more into Stravinsky, who I would say is a 20th century figure of Beethovenian importance. So let's get listening to Stravinsky, guys. So I guess I'm starting today with an unusual piece. It's a fragment, a tiny piano piece that Stravinsky composed for his old friend Claude Debussy when he died in 1918. And the famous version of this fragment is the one that he subsequently orchestrated for a wind ensemble and then attached a whole lot of new music on the front of that, and that became a wonderful piece called Symphonies of Wind Instruments. We haven't got time to talk about that whole piece today, but we're just going to look at the original piano fragment that formed what is now the chorale at the end of the Symphonies of Wind Instruments. First of all, let's talk a little bit about Stravinsky's relationship with Debussy. They first met after the premiere of the Firebird. The Firebird was composed when Stravinsky was 29, and I think it was premiered in 1910. And the premiere catapulted Stravinsky from a status of being an entirely unknown young Russian composer to being a European celebrity pretty much overnight. It was an absolutely astonishing transformation, and the kind that no classical composer could experience nowadays. It's a very specific thing for that period somehow, and it's all thanks to Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe. They were kingmakers. It was an extraordinary outfit, touring around Europe and revealing young geniuses in all the arts, because you had young geniuses composing the music for the ballets, you had artists of genius designing the costumes and the sets. You have all sorts of artists doing this, Picasso, Leger, Matisse, you know, all kinds of the leading figures in European art at the time were involved on that side, and then you had choreographers of genius and amazing ballet dancers. It was a sort of fulfillment of Wagner's idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total artwork, and there was Diaghilev going out with this amazing outfit and making European celebrities, international celebrities of these artists. And Stravinsky was perhaps the leading artist in terms of he was catapulted to fame in a particularly spectacular way. After the premiere of the Firebird, Debussy came up to him, spoke very warmly to him and invited him for dinner. So that was an immediate recognition by France's leading composer to this young talent who no one had known 2 hours earlier. So an amazing moment. And I think Stravinsky always sensed that moment when he was recognised by Debussy, and it was a sort of seal on his career, because once Debussy had taken notice of you and you were a young composer, well, your career was made. So that was an exciting moment. Debussy was clearly impressed by Stravinsky's genius, you know, a spectacular orchestration. Fabulous and exciting harmonies and sonorities that even he, Debussy, had not yet attempted. And so the two composers were influencing each other in subsequent years. There was a kind of rivalry, but also a very friendly correspondence between them, and it was slightly soured, I think, in 1913 when the Rite of Spring was an enormous hit. In the same season, and literally a week after the failure of Debussy's equally amazing ballet, Jeux. Jeux is an absolutely astonishing orchestral score, one of Debussy's greatest, but the ballet was really a flop, and both Jeux and the Rite of Spring were choreographed by Nijinsky, but the Rite of Spring was a huge, scandalous success. It was obviously a scandal, but it was also a huge celebrity moment, whereas Jeux, barely anyone noticed or remembered Jeux. I think that slightly sullied the relationship because great composers are nothing if not egotistical, and as soon as there's a sort of imbalance in terms of their reception, there tend to be awkward situations developing. Nevertheless, the friendship did continue, if in a slightly distant way. During the First World War, Stravinsky went to live in Switzerland to get away from the conflict. Debussy, on the other hand, remained in Paris. So I'm going to read from Expositions and Developments, which is a book, a conversation book between Stravinsky and Robert Kraft. This was in 1959 when Stravinsky was in his late 70s. So he's looking back on his early years, and they're discussing the rather sad late years of Debussy, and it says this: "I saw him rarely during the war, and the few visits I did pay him were extremely painful. His subtle, grave smile," this is Debussy, "his subtle, grave smile had disappeared, and his skin was yellow and sunken. It was hard not to see the future cadaver in him." That's a terrible description, isn't it? Debussy had cancer, slowly advancing cancer throughout the war years. And the miracle was that he continued to compose and composed some of his greatest music. The three sonatas, the wonderful cello sonata, the sonata for harp, flute and viola, which is really wonderful. And then the violin sonata, all astonishing chamber works. These were all composed in his last years. But he was sick and deeply upset by the progress of the First World War. I mean, it was an overwhelmingly dark time. And poor Debussy, he wasn't a happy man. So anyway, going on, Stravinsky said, "I asked him if he'd heard my 3 pieces for string quartet." I mean, ever the egoist, Stravinsky is really just obsessed with how people are viewing his music. "My 3 pieces for string quartet, which had just been played in Paris, I thought he would like the last 20 bars of the 3rd piece, for they are some of my best music of that time." He'd not heard them, however, and indeed, he had heard almost no music at all. Now, okay, there's something significant about the reason why Stravinsky mentions that. The 3rd of the string quartet pieces that he'd written, and the very passage he's talking about, is this beautiful chorale at the end of the 3 pieces. And that chorale marked an important new thing for Stravinsky, which points forward to the piece I'm going to play. It's the discovery. Stravinsky had discovered that he could compose these beautiful, slow, slightly ritualistic, rather moving, slow chorales. It became a bit of a thing that he could do, and he did it throughout his career. For example, the Symphony in C ends with just such a chorale. So he's very good at this kind of thing. And he wanted Debussy to notice, but Debussy hadn't heard it. And it's relevant because when he paid homage to Debussy after his death, he composed one of these chorales, which you'll hear in a minute. Okay, then he goes on to say, I saw him last about 9 months before his death. This was a triste visit, and Paris was grey, quiet, and without lights or movement. He did not mention the piece from Blanc et Noir he had written for me. Blanc et Noir is a magnificent piece for 2 pianos that Debussy wrote at the end of his life, and the middle movement was dedicated to Stravinsky. And Stravinsky goes on to say, and when I received this music, the music from Blanc et Noir, in Morges, that's where he was living in Switzerland, late in 1919, I was very moved by it, as well as delighted to see that it was such a good composition. I was moved too when I composed my symphonies to the memory of my old friend, and if I may say so, they too are a good composition. And he's not wrong. Blanc et Noir is certainly a good composition, a masterful composition, and so is Symphonies of Wind Instruments, his own memorial to Debussy. So let's look at this fragment. The original piece that was published in a magazine shortly after Debussy's death was this. It wasn't the Symphonies of Wind Instruments, it was this piano piece. In a minute when you see the score, you'll see there are no dynamics in the published score. There are just these lines. There's no time signature either. No dynamics, no time signature, barely any phrasing. It's just laid out like a sort of very, very austere thing, almost as if you're meant to read it and think, how touching, or something. It's a fascinating thing. Possibly it's influenced by Eric Satie, who we featured so much on the channel. Stravinsky and Satie were friends. It has a slightly Satie-ish quality. Not the sound of the music, but the layout. And it features this very characteristic and fabulous chord. I was talking to a composer friend of mine a while ago about how Stravinsky, more than almost any other composer I can think of, was the inventor of astonishingly memorable sonic objects. They're almost like, I don't know what they're like sort of sound icons. They're so rich and weighty. They almost carry you into another world. It's hard to describe. It's something to do with the way the chords are spaced. Stravinsky did everything very painstakingly at the keyboard, and you can see the physicality. This is very typical of Stravinsky. The physicality of playing is a key part of the creative process. So the right hand has this huge chord with a 10th stretch, and the left hand also has a 10th stretch. Now that would give you a G7, but then he stuck this A flat in it as well, so you get this wonderful, isn't that fantastic, blend of G major, oddly spaced G major, with a 7th, added 7th on the left hand, and then an A flat, so sort of D diminished in the left hand against G. Marvellous. You'll remember the famous Rite spring chord, which combines E flat 7 in the right hand, F flat 7 in the left. He's a master at this kind of thing, these chord combinations, where you carefully, and he was careful, choose two very specific chords with a very specific spacing and set them against each other. And you get this wonderful object. And it's the same here. This wonderful rich sound. So that's the first thing to say. The fragment that you'll hear in a minute is full of these magnificent harmonies that are often the result of these combinations of these chords to create new kinds of sonic objects. Very typical of Stravinsky's practice, and it gives rise to this new kind of harmony. I suppose that's all I could describe it as. The second thing, also absolutely characteristic of him, so you've got this wonderful harmony, and then you've got this absolutely original approach to rhythm. Just like the Rite spring, but in a kind of slowed down version, we have a rhythmic repetition. So for example, let's go back to the Rite spring, where you have these wonderful pulsing rhythms with repetition. And in the Danse Sacrale, you have this wonderful thing. And the wonderful thing is, you never quite know when the pulse is going to come. So you've got that pulsing, but you never know if it's going to go 1 or 1, 2. And it's the same in this beautiful fragment, except it's slow. So you get 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, that sort of thing. At the end, it becomes even more pronounced. 1, 1, 2, 1, 1. So these patterns of 1 or 1, 2 that you can never quite predict. Somehow they seem very satisfying because they have a kind of tread, a sort of intensity, but there's also an unpredictability about it. So it's the combination of these rich sonorities and this wonderful rhythm that makes it so special. And the third thing is the organisation of the whole thing, the form. It consists of these beautifully interleaved sonic objects. So you have this, and then you'll have something else, and then you'll have a third thing, and then you'll return to the first, and then the third thing. So it's a constant sort of shifting, shuffling back and forth from one idea to the next. And towards the end, a wonderful opening out towards a kind of diatonic harmony, in other words, a sort of white note harmony. Towards the end, it finds resolution in this repeating E minor chord, and then D9, wonderful. Back to the E minor again, E minor, D9 again. Isn't that magnificent? And every now and again, these beautiful, sort of memorable melodic fragments, and then opening out again towards the end of this gorgeously spaced. It's fantastic. So, and then at the very end, it turns almost unexpectedly to C major with some added notes at the top. Unexpected, and yet somehow you realise when you get to the end that the whole piece has been leading up to that cadence. Really astonishing. So we've got form, we've got rhythm, we've got harmony all working together. One other thing I'll point out, because it comes up in the video, you've got the opening chord, but sometimes he adds this double appoggiatura, in other words, 2 leaning notes. So if that's the main chord, it's just like in Baroque music where you might have 2 leaning notes that resolve into the chord. Here, the 2 leaning notes are A flat and C, which go up to D and B. So a double appoggiatura, and it's wonderfully expressive. You know, people think Stravinsky's not expressive. Yes, he is. He's a master. He's not romantic, but he's deeply expressive. It's very interesting that in the description with Robert Kraft, he says, "I was moved too when I composed my symphonies to the memory of my old friend." So Stravinsky is very pointedly saying, I was moved. I was moved by his death, and I wrote moving music in response. People often think of Symphonies of Wind as some sort of blank, abstract piece. It isn't. It's full of emotion. Towards the end of the chorale, he expands on that double appoggiatura. Like this. He takes that tune and just... he just sort of lets the melody fly over the top. In the wind version, it's particularly beautiful because there's a solo trumpet just soaring over the top of the ensemble. So just to summarise before the animated video of this wonderful chorale, what you're about to hear is the beautiful original piano version that was published in honour of Debussy, which Stravinsky composed in 1920, before he then went on to incorporate it as the final section of his masterpiece, Symphonies of Wind Instruments. And if you haven't heard that, check it out. It's an absolutely prodigiously wonderful piece. So, enjoy. Hello everyone, Loki and I just want to say that the actual film of Stravinsky's wonderful memorial to Debussy that became the Symphonies of Wind Instruments is actually in a different video. This is for copyright reasons. We've decided to release it as a separate video. So if you check the video description below or click on the link above, you should be able to find it right away. It's just we've had to publish it in a different place.